Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to a new session here on the Shift Network Sound Healing Summit. Thank you for joining us once again. And our special guest coming up this time is Joshua Leeds. Joshua Leeds is a music producer, sound researcher, and educator. He specializes in psychoacoustics, the study of the effects of music and sound on the human nervous system, along with bioacoustics, how human sound affects animals. He is the author of the books The Power of Sound, Through a Dog's Ear, Sonic Alchemy, and the forthcoming Sound Work on a Hot Rock. He has also produced numerous specialized soundtracks that are used in clinics, classrooms, homes, and animal care facilities worldwide. Joshua, welcome.
Hey, Alec, it's nice to be here with you.
Hey, great to see you again, and happy to have you back talking about the topic that you've chosen today, because it just forms a nice complement. Because my first session on this summit, I was interviewing Andy and Jonathan Goldman, who, among other things, talked about conscious humming. It's now getting into the work of Tomatis, as you'll tell us more details here in a few moments. And a lot of his focus was intentional, deep listening. So those are just nice bookends. Those are probably the biggest two category headings in the whole sound work. You have the intentional creation of sound, and then the receptive, not passivity, but the receiving of sound as a listener and perceiver. So the active and the passive. So thank you for that. Yeah, so
for me, actually, just kind of keying off of that, if you don't mind. As we know, the world is a dual world we live in. Duality is everywhere. And the fact that we are so wired for sound to take it in and to make it is the duality of the auditory and the phonology system, that the ear is so connected with the voice. And that ties in totally to the topic that I wanted to speak about today, being Alfred Tomatis. So I'm going to pass the Tomatis stick back to you.
Right on, because as you just noted, there is a major synergy and feedback loop between the two. So let's just get rolling. So Tomatis, maybe start with your background. Like, how did you discover the work of Tomatis, and what has been important about it for you?
Well, great. So I'm delighted to be back here on the Shift Network Sound Summit. And when I thought about what would be of great value to present today, I thought about the work of Alfred Tomatis, who was a French ear, nose, and throat surgeon. He lived from 1920 to 2001. And my friend Alec was the one who actually brought this to my attention, that nobody was talking about Alfred Tomatis and the work of Alfred Tomatis in 2019, when we did the first Sound Summit on the Shift Network. And I was the last one to be interviewed. And Alex said to me, "You're the only person who has even mentioned Tomatis." And that really had a big impact on me. It really caused me to sit back and to think about that, and to wonder why it was that just 20 years after his death, a man who certainly in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s was such a vibrant and important source of sound work philosophy, that it was as if he was setting the foundation of thought, of concept, of what is it about sound that is important? What is it about the auditory mechanism that is important? Why do we think that using sound and sound frequency and vibration, that it really makes a difference on the human nervous system? And Alfred Tomatis was the guy. He was the dude. He was the cat. He was the king. And that was the reason why I thought about the title of this presentation as being Alfred Tomatis, the King of Sound, because I thought about other people who have claimed that moniker. And Alfred Tomatis never said, hey, I'm the king of sound. But when you mentioned to me that out of 35 people that you interviewed, 35 teachers and sound work practitioners, not one of them but me had mentioned Tomatis, that I realized that, maybe it is an important thing for us to reinsert the core principles of Alfred Tomatis into the conversation about why is sound work important in 2021? And what can we do with sound work in 2021 in these very confusing and uncertain times that we live in? And how does the philosophy of Alfred Tomatis tie in to all of this? How do his basic considerations impact us? So I've been in sound work since 1985, when I first met Louise Hay in Los Angeles, the author of You Can Heal Your Life. And I was a struggling, starving Hollywood film composer. And I pivoted into the work of using music and sound intentionally because that felt like it had more juice for me. It was more important. It felt to me like it was more dynamic in terms of the work that I came here to do. And so I began looking for a place to study sound, and the only place to study sound in 1990 was with the author Don Campbell at his therapeutic sound school in Denver. And so I came out in the early 90s and I began to look at what was the basis of therapeutic music and sound, and more so outside of the realm of music therapy, because I was looking at how sound could be used either in the process of music or as sound just by itself in its most naked form of vibration and frequency, or adding the intervals and the instruments, and now it becomes music. And Don Campbell had just written the foreword, the preface actually, to Alfred Tomatis's autobiography called The Conscious Ear, a book that changed my life and that actually caused me to then devote the rest of my life to this field of sound work, where I went, how can I make a difference? How can I do something that is meaningful? And this is in 1990, and this is before we're in the middle of all the hullabaloo that we're in the middle now with global warming and with pandemics and with, it feels like the world just kind of coming apart at the seams, and a reset, a big reset, and a big renaissance. And so for those of you who have read my books or have heard me speak before, then you know that I'm real big into this idea of us moving into a renaissance period out of this time of uncertainty. And towards the end of this, if Alec is kind enough and I don't talk too much and he gives me the opportunity, I want to talk about the relationship of sound work in these current times. But talking about how I came into the work of Alfred Tomatis, it was through the therapeutic sound schools in Denver, and I happened to meet one of the other students there, and he is a wonderful psychiatrist by the name of Ron Minson. And he had basically expanded his psychiatric practice to include the Tomatis method, which was the sound therapy that was created by Alfred Tomatis. And I asked him if I could attend in his clinic, and he said, yes, please do. And that really changed my life on a personal level, because I had the opportunity to retune my ears and to begin to understand as a sound worker the vital importance of auditory, of audition, and understanding that it was not just about us hearing chit-chat, and it was not just about a communication tool, but that actually the auditory system was about charging the neocortex of the brain using sound. And so over the last 30 years, Tomatis has remained one of the primary people that I consider to be a mentor in my life. I never met Tomatis, Alec, At the time when I came into the exploration of his work was in the last 10 years of his life. And there was a lot of personal stuff that was surrounding him. And as we all have to deal with in our being on the planet. And I decided that I just wanted to fall in love with his work. And I didn't want to get involved in the personal things that he was dealing with as a guy on the planet. And so from a professional level, Tomatis' core principles have significantly informed my outlook and my work with sound as a producer and as a writer, as a thinker. And that's the reason why I felt that it was so important to bring this to this symposium at this time.
Very good. So now keep rolling more about those core principles. You mentioned a major one in passing there, the Tomatis concept, that one of the previously unrecognized primary functions of the ear is to charge the brain and nervous system with electrical energy. So keep going on those core principles.
Yeah, okay, all right. So basically, when I wrote my book, The Power of Sound in 2000, or when it was published in 2001, and I was writing it in 98, 99, 2000, I spent a lot of time with Ron Minson being able to clarify what were the foundational thoughts that the Tomatis method, which is the sound therapy that Tomatis created, what were the basic principles behind that? And what I came to understand is there were basically 7 of them. And the first one is the primary function of the ear is to charge the brain. In looking at that, it's really the primary function of the ear is to convert sound waves to electrochemical impulses that charge the neocortex of the brain. And in thinking about that, it was really a revelation for me, because I came to the conclusion that here we think that the purpose of our ears is for communication. I'm sitting here having a conversation that I'm monopolizing most of with Alec. And we are talking and we're using our words and we are hearing each other. But the point that Tomatis was bringing forward was, that's not really the primary reason why we have ears. The primary reason why we have this auditory sense is because sound is as vital on a certain level as food, that sound charges the nervous system, that we need sound as much as we need food. And you can imagine that this caused Tomatis to be a very controversial guy, because people were going, that's ridiculous. Are you kidding? You're comparing sound to food? And yet, when I think about this new generation of sound workers that are spending so much time thinking about frequency and vibroacoustics and how it is that we use frequency or vibration or sound, all interchangeable, because they're all different approximations of the same energy. They're just different octaves of it. And so when we think about how much people are working with bells and bowls and gongs, they're working with frequency. And this is right along what Tomatis was talking about. He was talking about how we use sound, vibration of sound, to charge the neocortex of the brain. And as we know, the neocortex of the brain is a really important part of being human, and without it working very well, we're in a lot of trouble. And so he then basically went, high sounds charge the nervous system, and lower, baser sounds tend to discharge the nervous system. And so if we think along the spectrum of what arouses the nervous system, you want to drink a cup of coffee to arouse the nervous system. Well, you can use sound to do the same thing as you can use caffeine or other substances or food or sugar or whatever to be able to basically ignite the nervous system. And if we use the lower sounds, then the lower sounds tend to calm the nervous system. They tend to, what he would say, discharge the nervous system. Now, it's a whole conversation about, we could spend a weekend talking about this, and we don't have the time to do that. But the idea of charging the brain is a big deal. And it ties into the concept of sound as a nutrient for the nervous system. If I walked away with only one of Tomatis's, or Tomatis, depending upon where we're from, if I walked away with only one of his core principles, the idea that sound is a nutrient for the nervous system has informed my work for the last 30 years. The idea that looking at the value of sound and the importance of auditory health, when we think about nutrients, the image of being able to digest food arises. Can you imagine if you could not digest proteins? It would have a significant impact, whether or not they're vegetarian proteins or meat proteins or whatever. But when you think about our ability, the digestive system, how imperative it is that it is working properly for us to have a healthy, balanced nervous system and body and life. Well, I would posit that it is the same thing. How do we digest sound? And this is where Alfred Tomatis moved into a whole different realm of thinking, because he started to think about what is it that happens with the nervous system when sound is distorted, when sound is minimized, when we do not take in a full, healthy spectrum of sound. And he realized that it was basically a middle ear function that was causing that, or was tied in with that in a big way. And up until that time that Tomatis came along, the middle ear was viewed as, well, important anatomy, but not so important, that it was like its main function was the three bones, the ossicles of the middle ear, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, or the stapes and the incus and the malleus, that von Bekisi in 1961 won a Nobel Prize for his exploration of the auditory system. And what he was basically saying was the primary purpose of the middle ear was to make it so that those three bones, if too loud of a sound came plowing through, that they would, if they had time, kind of collapse, and the two tiny muscles would become flaccid, and it would protect the cochlea, the inner ear. And Tomatis came along and he said, whoa, you got it all wrong, man. Because connected to these three tiny muscles, three tiny bones, are these two really tiny muscles, the tensor tympani and the stapedius muscle. They're so small. Alec, you might say, how small are they? They are so small that they are omitted from most physiology drawings. And yet Tomatis came to the realization that they were so important that they might possibly be two of the most important muscles in the entire body. And Alec might say, why is that?
Please tell us, why is that, Joshua?
Well, Alec, I'm so glad you asked. The reason why he thought that those muscles were really important was because it ends up like they're like an online sampler. They could go, these frequencies not good for us. These frequencies of sound that are coming in, we want to kind of tune them out. We want to tone them down. I had a father who was very angry. He was very, very angry at life. And the way that manifested itself was he yelled a lot. And so what did I do? I didn't do it on purpose, but it ends up that these two tiny muscles are totally tied in with our psychological well-being, which is as important as our physiological well-being if we're going to have a whole life. And what ended up happening was, over years, I basically tuned him down so that when he would go to do that thing, I basically didn't hear him, or for that matter, at 1500 hertz. the adult male voice. That's the reason why all my favorite teachers were women. And when I had classes with men, I didn't do as well, but I didn't understand it until I went in the early 90s into the therapeutic setting to do the Tomatis method. And they did a listening test, and they found out that I had this big gap at 1500 hertz. And afterwards, Dr. Minson said to me, "Oh, you have trouble with your dad?" I had never even had a conversation with him. And he could tell just by looking at my listening test. And what those two tiny muscles had basically done was, this guy is messing with your psychological outlook on life. And we're just going to kind of tune it down. So when we talk about sound as a nutrient, then we have these two tiny muscles that are able to tell, do we have a critical teacher? Do we have a brother or a sister that is making sounds that keep on upsetting us? Do we have a parent, a parental unit that is not working out very well for us? Are there sounds that we're hearing all the time that make us want to go like this? It ends up that we've got this extraordinary onboard system of being able to go, what is good nutrient and what is nutrient that is not so good? Just kind of like our stomach would all of a sudden go, we're not so sure that what you just ate is so good for you. And we're going to upchuck. We're not going to do that anymore. And so the body is equipped with the same ability to do that. And so that means that Tomatis figured out it was the retuning of the middle ear that would give us a full spectrum of sound and help to be able to restore areas in our life that psychologically or physiologically have been damaged. So this is all about damage control. This is why it's so important. But it's not because, we want to take in a full spectrum of sound, so we can take in a full spectrum of sound. It's because by taking in a full spectrum of sound, we get to up our listening game. Now, let's make a distinction. In the core principles here, there's a difference between hearing and listening. Now, some people call Tomatis the founder of the field of sound listening training as we become more sophisticated in our understanding of this. Because we're going, well, what's the difference between hearing and listening? So in the concept of listening, there are three functions to the ear. One is balance. We know we have the vestibular system that sits on top of the cochlea that makes the difference between us being horizontal or being vertical. We know that we've talked about cortical charge and how important sound is for bringing energy into the nervous system, that we need a cortical charge that comes through the auditory, and whether or not it's coming through the ears or it's coming through the skin, it's coming in. But then the third is about hearing. But we know that listening is not hearing. Listening is the ability to use one's hearing intentionally for the purpose of learning and communication. Let me say it again. Listening is the ability to use one's hearing when we're hearing, and we go into active listening as opposed to passive hearing. We are getting intentional for the purpose of learning and communication. So what happens when we don't learn very well? What happens when we don't communicate very well? We're going to have a very, very different life, given the fact that we have to be here with 7 billion other souls on this planet in body. Now, if we do not have an easy way of being able to learn about how to be here and to communicate what it feels like to be here, then what happens? We're going to go like this. We're going to just go inward. We're going to just disappear. We're just going to pull back. We're going to withdraw. We're going to find ourselves where our auditory processing, where our sensory integration, where our speech and language, our learning processes, our concentration and our attention and our memory, our posture and our balance and our motor coordination are all impacted by us withdrawing. That's a pretty serious list of things that I just ran down. And when you add them all up, the difference between being present in life versus being withdrawn in life is a big deal. And that's where Tomatis's work fits in, because he figured out what happens in the ear, how we close down. It can be pathological. It can be happened at birth. It could be because of hearing allergies, food allergies that caused us to have auditory infections, ear infections as a kid. It could be because we were born wired in a different way. It could be because we have psychological things that have come at us. It could be any number of things that cause the auditory system to shut down. And Tomatis figured out, let's open it up. And the middle ear is the place that we do it. And von Bekisi just wins a Nobel Prize saying, the middle ear isn't really about anything except for softening loud sound coming in, the sound of a shotgun coming in, and hopefully everything works well enough to diminish the sound and protect the inner ear. And along comes Tomatis, and Tomatis says, wow, hold on, you're only getting part of the picture. You forgot about these two tiny muscles, and these two tiny muscles kind of become flaccid. So let's tighten up these two tiny muscles. And that's what his therapy is about. But we're not talking about his therapy so much, because we're talking about his core principles. And his core principles are really about the significance of listening. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's about listening is one of the ways we perceive the world. And if we don't have good listening, we are, how you say, not good. I'm self-editing, but we're not like, it's like if we do not have good listening skills, then we don't have social skills. And if we don't have social skills, we're not going to have we're not going to have an optimal life. We might have a different life. And there are lots of people that are very withdrawn who still have extraordinary lives. So I'm not saying that the only way you can have a good life is by having good listening skills and good middle ear function, but I'm saying that for most of us, if you're not Helen Keller, and if you're not, Stephen Hawking, and if you're not, people who have had to have learned how to do extraordinary things in spite of sensory neural impairment. Most of us are not that way. So it really helps to have good onboard gear. And our auditory is a really important part of that. So learn how to train listening skills with music and sound. But more important than that, from my vantage point, than his sound therapy, the Tomatis therapy. And there are many derivatives of it. And there are many people that have been trained in the use of the electronic ear and in many of his therapeutic concepts. But what I really want to talk about is this concept of how the auditory function helps grow the nervous system. Because this is something that sound therapists, regardless of whether or not they're doing Tomatis work or not, can incorporate these very, very important concepts. Sound is a nutrient for the nervous system. The primary role of the ear is to charge the nervous system. The primary function of the auditory system is to charge the nervous system. Sound is a nutrient. Not all sounds are good. Too much sound can be like too much water, right? But one of the most important things that he said was how we can duplicate only the sounds we can hear. Tomatis was treated poorly by the French Academy of Science, the French Academy of Medicine. So much so, because he was such a renegade, that even though he was an ear, nose, and throat doctor, and even though he was coming up with all of these concepts having to do with throat and not so much nose, but definitely with ear, then he was basically harassed to the point where he went, here, you can have your doctor's licenses back. I'm not even a doctor anymore. I don't want to be a doctor. And 20 years later or so, they come back and they say, please, we would like to, please be a doctor again. And we want to name something, a theorem, a scientific theorem that we're going to call the Tomatis effect. And that is, we can duplicate only the sounds that we can hear. What's the big deal about that? The big deal about that is that What we take in is what we can reproduce. And if we can't take it in, then it's going to cause our voices to be like this. If all of a sudden we can't take in the frequencies, then we're not going to have a resonant voice. We're going to have a voice that reflects basically our relationship to the world. That's the reason why people work with the voice, because they realize, so all of you sound workers that are voice people, vocal people, please look into this. This is so important. If we can't take in the sound, we can't reproduce it. There's also, I'm about to finish up on this piece, and thanks, Alex, for letting me roll so long on this. There's a woman by the name of Doreen Davis that I want to also add into this equation. Doreen Davis is an audiologist, and she is also probably one of the most heavily trained sound workers that I know. She's trained in 15 different methods of sound therapies. And as an audiologist, she realized that it was very important that you figure out that one sound therapy might not be the same for Jim as it is for Jenny. That not one sound therapy works for everybody. And so Doreen Davis, coming out of the audiology tradition, realized that in sound therapy, she's the author of Sound Bodies Through Sound Therapy, which is an extraordinary book that I highly recommend. And she created a diagnostic evaluation for therapy protocol to just go, okay, there are all these amazing sound therapies. There's Berard sound therapy. There's brain fitness and the listening program and Simonis and therapeutic listening and Linda Mood Bell processing and medical resonance and all of these extraordinary sound therapies that have been developed, most of them based upon Tomatis' principles over the course of the last 50 years. And she basically went, we need to have a diagnostic evaluation. And so she created that. I strongly urge you to look up Doreen Davis at doreendavis.com, DORINNE Davis, DAVIS.com, because she also created something called the Davis Addendum to the Tomatis Effect. You go, wow, as if like there wasn't enough to think about here with the Tomatis core principles. But she became very involved in the fact that at a given point, the ear, it is called autoacoustic emissions, and that the ear, if you have the proper gear in the ear, you can actually hear that we are emitting a sound and a frequency out of the ear. So this is now no longer a one-way street. And she basically then tied that in with the Tomatis effect, that we can only reproduce the sounds that we can hear. And she came up with 2 laws that she called them, that she felt that we needed to add to it, which is the ear emits the same stressed frequencies that are emitted by the voice. So in other words, if my 1500 hertz, if I'm shut down at 1500 hertz, because I've basically have figured out subconsciously or auditorily, not consciously, that that's going to keep me sane around my yelling father, my voice is going to reflect that. It's not going to have that 1500 hertz. And what she's saying is the ear is going to emit the same stress frequencies. Well, we go, well, do we really care about that? Like, it's like we're walking around and you're telling me that the ear with autoacoustic emissions, OTO, autoacoustic emissions, is actually putting out frequency? And now I'm putting out the 1500 hertz out of my ear? No wonder why there's so much noise pollution out there. Everybody's walking around putting out all their weird frequencies out of their ears. Okay, so this is a weird concept, and it's an extraordinary concept. And it's a 21st century concept. And it's Doreen Davis and Sherry Edwards' work, and people who are tuning into the ear in a little bit of a different way. The second law was when complementary or supplementary frequencies of stressed frequencies are introduced via sound vibration to the ear, vocal patterns regain coherence. So that's tied in with Tomatis. He's saying, what are the frequencies that we need to restore, that we need to use to excite and rebalance the two tiny muscles of the middle ear? And she is talking about it in a little bit of a different way. So the reason why I bring her up is because the wild and woolly world of Tomatis has got lots of room to grow. And here we are, sound workers in the 21st century. Now, let's not take the baby and throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's keep what applies. Let's keep what makes sense to us and innovate it. Take the technological measuring tools that we've got now and measure, and therefore create additional tools or different ways to do what Tomatis did, what he was able to bring forward with what he had available to him. Look what we have available now. And the bottom line of what I'm saying is, everybody who's working with sound, look into this guy, Tomatis. He's gold. It's golden. Let's not let him slip away. He's our Bach. When Bach died, it took 75 or 80 years. His entire oeuvre, all of his work went away for 80 years. And it took a composer out of France to be able to say, hey, look what I discovered. Are you kidding? There's over 1,100 symphonies here in string quartets. Bach is like the greatest composer in the world, in the universe. Maybe not in the universe, but here. Let's not let that happen to Tomatis. Let's not let him slip away. Let's build. He's got big shoulders. Let's build. Let's stand on his shoulders. Don't let his work fall away. It's too important. And guys like me, who've been in this since like the 80s and before that, we're getting old. And the mantle is being passed to the new generation of sound workers, and they're not talking about Tomatis. Read his book, The Conscious Ear. It will blow your mind. It's so cool. You'll love it. It will cause you to go, I can be in this field for the rest of my life, because he points to how deep it is. Alec, you're a champ. Thank you for letting me just go on with this, and I appreciate it.
Well, keep rolling. I could have made many comments along the way, but I want to make sure we cover these core principles of Tomatis.
Yeah.
I think you might have a couple more, but one thing I want to make sure that we do hit is one thing I recall from your discussion of Tomatis and the Power of Sound book is that bit about, noting how early the ear develops in utero, and how the ear is not only responsible for charging our nervous system in life, but also responsible for growing the brain early in development. Want to do a few minutes on that one?
Yeah, I will. So one of Tomatis's core principles, and let me just dial this back up so I've got this to be able to stay on top of it, is that communication is a process that begins in utero. Okay, the unborn child hears as early as the 4th month after conception. Now, Tomatis actually believed that that sound actually helps grow the fetus's brain and nervous system, and that even before the auditory system is developed by 4 months, that the sound of the mother's voice and the sound of the internal environment of the mother's body are as important in utero to growing the unborn, the fetal brain and nervous system, as sound is post-birth to then nourishing the nervous system. And so he's saying it starts way back. Auditory is not like just like a flippant sense. And I'm not going to compare and prioritize what's more important. Is it more important to see, or is it more important to hear? Or is it more important to have a sense of touch or a sense of smell? But what I am going to do is I'm going to talk about the sense of the auditory. One of the things that Tomatis said that Alec brought up, it's so great that Alec serves as the moderator for these or many of these interviews, is because he's a guy who's been studying sound for a long time. And he's the one who actually reminded me that Tomatis said that many people this is what Tomatis said, but many people consider the ear to be differentiated skin, meaning that it's just kind of like a different formation of skin hanging here on the side of our heads. And Tomatis says, no, you have that all wrong. Skin is actually differentiated ear. He just turned it around. You can see why the guys in the 1950s and the 1940s in France, they were just going, get rid of this guy. This guy is dangerous, because he was turning it all upside down. He was just saying, no, get this straight. The entire body covered in skin is ear. We can feel vibration through our skin, and we've got miles of skin. So he's saying, even if this auditory function doesn't work so well, we still hear through our skin all over. And so he's saying that the newborn baby, the fetus, not even the newborn baby, the fetus is hearing immediately, like within days of conception. The fetus is being grown by sound. And so what is the fetus surrounded by? The sound of the mama. So in the Tomatis method, part of the function of the electronic ear, which is to highly filter mostly music, but there's an active phase of the Tomatis method of the actual therapeutic 6-week therapeutic program. That part of it is about, if it's possible, having a recording of the mother's voice that is fed back through the electronic ear, that makes it sound as if you're hearing it, reminds you of what it was like to hear your mother's voice in utero. Now, man, that's got to be a day at the beach. That has got to be a serious piece if you can arrange to have that, to be able to revisit in your auditory and your cerebral memory, what did your mother sound like when you were inside? Now, that's probably not more of a primal sound of safety than that sound for most of us. For most of us. And so when he ties in sound and the impact of sound all the way from minutes after conception to where we are now in our grown lives. This is the reason why he's saying the ability to listen is one of the most important things, skill sets that we can have in our lives.
Yeah, that just gets very deep, what you just discussed. It's a really profound sonic rebirthing.
Yes. Yeah, it is deep.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about there. And I'm also stuck on, I'm glad you mentioned that bit about the ear and the skin, because that's a very interesting sort of consciousness expanding, conscious altering exercise you can basically play with right now. That thought that the ear, your whole skin surface is an extension of the ear, or your whole skin surface is an ear. That could get into a very trippy headspace if you meditate on that and try to feel that. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely do. And so when you think about all of the people in sound work now, and it seems to me that currently so many people are attracted to the work with frequency. and then with the tools of frequency. And what are we doing? What are we doing with that? And where do we come upon what frequencies do what? And what level of care are we exerting in determining these frequencies? If we go, sound is a medicine, frequency is a medicine. And it's not being administered just through here, it's being administered everywhere. And we know that the auditory reflects our psychological relationship to the world. So what are we doing with frequency? I hope we're being really careful. I'm using, the universal we here. That we're being very, very careful with the use of sound. Are we bombarding the body with sound? Are we being gentle with sound? Do we know what to do with somebody who has a specific emotional or psychological that might end up portraying itself as a physiological reaction? Do we know what to do with them? See, this is where the value of the people who became music therapists is. One of the many values of the people that became music therapists, because what they learned how to do was to be able to say, we're going to use music, i.e. sound, i.e. vibration, frequency. We're going to use music and sound to help people make a change. But what happens if we think we're going right and they go left? What do we do with that? Like, if we want sound to be able to sit at the table of responsible healing modalities, are we well enough trained? And if we're not, then let's go get it. That's the nice thing about being an adult learner, is we go, oh, let me see, actually, I could use some of that. And let's go on Google and figure out where to get it and pay our $500 and get the information, or pay our $5,000 and get the information, or don't pay anything and get the information, whatever. But like, let's be really responsible sound workers, because we all know the intensity of sound. This comes back around to what Alec and I were talking about, the dual relationship that we have with sound. We know how to take it in. Then we're talking about Doreen Davis and Sherry Edwards and autoacoustic emissions out of the ear. But let's say that's so out there that we're going to go, well, let's pretend like we didn't even talk about that one. Let's leave that cat in the bag. Let's just talk about, we know how to take it in and we know how to put it out. And everybody on the planet is equipped with the gear. So now, how are we using it? Brothers and sisters, how are we using what it is that we are so attracted to, so that we are responsible in our work? And I want to say that this guy, Alfred, Dr. Alfred, as my friend Jonathan Goldman calls him, Al. It's like, how does understanding his core principles up our game, make us heavier, more serious, lighter, cool, more effective? I'm telling you, that's where it is. And I'm going to give you some resources that you can dial it up. Just go online. There are a couple of books that any sound worker should have on their shelf. I know I'm being a little, I don't mean to be preachy, I don't mean to be didactic, but I'm telling you, it was when Alex said to me, nobody, 34 people, and you're number 35, and nobody's talking about Tomatis. And I'm going, damn, I better write another book. Maybe people only want to read a book that's been published since 2020, so I'll write it. So I'm writing that book because I want my fellow sound workers to have the best foundation to work from. And if you're and Tomatis, he's the dude, he's the cat, he's the guy. You know what I mean, Alec?
Yeah. And thank you for that service and selflessness of coming here to talk about Tomatis rather than your own particular work, which we'll direct people to in a moment. But maybe that's part of your mission, to be a a voice for Tomatis and keeping him alive. This is just such a massively important body of work. So we have to make sure that it thrives and gets passed on. As you said, there's still so much to develop from the foundation that he provided us with. So thanks for that inspiration. You mentioned a list of resources for more about Tomatis' work and more specifics about his methods. Where could people go to view that list?
I'll make sure that I have this posted on the front page of my website, because I can't think of anything more important. And my website is my name, Joshua Leeds, Joshua, Leeds, LEEDS.com. Real easy.
There you go. So find your way to Joshua's site for more of these Tomatis researches, and also more to find out more about Joshua's work. It's like we mentioned his work in passing a few times, The Power of Sound. That's in my view, one of those top shelf classics in the sound healing field that belongs on everyone's shelf. And also Sonic Alchemy, in the spirit of what we're doing now. Joshua did this 30 years ago-ish. Sonic Alchemy went and conducted interviews with, at that time, the true pioneers, the roots of this current wave of awareness on sound healing. Joshua was there, one of the first people like getting the dominoes in motion that we're all enjoying here now on summits such as this. So thank you for that. And I'd also have to shout out, since I mentioned Joshua's also talking about the evolution of the future, and that's key. I always like to call attention to the roots in the past. There's so much stuff. You mentioned Don Campbell in brief passing. His book, Music Physician for Times to Come, I also say is an essential classic. If you want to pursue sound, you have to get that book, because that's one of the foundations of the whole field. And even though that book is 30 years old, there's stuff that's still way ahead of its time as far as a lot of the stuff you see in the current popular marketplace. And so, just note there's a deep wellspring to draw from and continue to enjoy.
Alec, may I also make a referral to somebody else who is on this Sound Summit that is a great font of wisdom and understanding of the work of Alfred Tomatis. His name is Alex Doman. And Alex has been a colleague of mine for a long, long time. And this is a man who developed a Tomatis-based program called the Listening Program here in America. It's an at-home program, and it's an extraordinary program. And I was really glad to see that he's going to be one of the speakers. And Alex comes from a lineage of people who work with children and adults with different kinds of cognitive wiring considerations. He comes multi-generationally, and he is a wise man. I was going to call him a wise guy, and he is a wise guy, but he's a wise man. And he's going to, I don't know what he's presenting during this year, but Alex Doman, because I'm sure that he will be, his speech is, well, he's like all of us. When you have Tomatis in your blood, then it's going to inform everything you do.
Cool, nice one. That actually ties my last threads together, because Alex was also a close collaborator with Don Campbell near the end of Don's life, and to a certain degree carrying on the mantle of his work. And what was the book they did at the end? It was like
Healing at the Speed of Sound.
Yeah. So Don Campbell, Alex Doman, and the star of our show today, Alfred Tomatis.
Alfred Tomatis, the king of sound. It's like, I just got to say, like Elvis had it going on. Michael Jackson had it going on. Alfred Tomatis, he's the king of sound.
There you go. So you recommended his autobiography, Conscious Ear. But for a great start on Tomatis' work, Joshua's book, Power of Sound, and the chapters in Music Physician for Times to Come will take you a long way.
And as a matter of fact, we keep on speaking about Don, when he wrote the Mozart Effect, it got taken and it went in the wrong direction because they took it in terms of the Mozart Effect. But really, it was being built on the work of Tomatis. And Don Campbell was a very, very serious student of Alfred Tomatis's. And so there are a lot of places where you can find information and self-plug, little shameless self-promotion here. My next book, Sound Work on a Hot Rock, which God willing is going to be coming out in 2022, is motivated by the necessity of the work of Tomatis staying alive. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of Tomatis in there.
So there you go. Keep an eye out for the forthcoming Sound Work on a Hot Rock. And yeah, just encourage you to find your way over to Joshua's site, because there's a lot of other dimensions to his work that we didn't have time to get to today due to the focus on Tomatis. So thank you again for that service. And on that note, our time is ticking away here today to our final second. So I just have to say thank you for being here again, Joshua. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Alec. It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Right on. And speaking of appreciation, we always have to say thank you again to the Shift Network for providing this platform. And thank you all for being there listening. You are appreciated, and we'll just send you all best wishes and vibes for your continued explorations into the sound world and your continued journeys on the sound current. Thank you for being with us.